Hello, I'm Neil Brownsword, Professor of Ceramics at Staffordshire University. Apologies I can't be with you in person today, but many thanks for joining me this afternoon to share insights into my artistic research, past and present. For over 2 decades, my work has mediated transitions within Stoke-on-Trent's ceramic manufacturing sector, following the impact of global economics in the 1990s. It reflects upon the significance of people and their practices affected by these transitions through the fluid perspectives of artistic research. Using a broad range of material expressions, it offers an alternative to the traditional text-based discourse concerning industrial change commonly addressed by economists, historians and other academics. The work, which I personally frame as provocations and reimaginings, addresses the value of craft as an essential human and necessary component of our creative being. My continued attachment to the past has always allowed for a critical interrogation of this history and its future trajectory. So, as much as I love museums, I don't see the future of ceramics in Stoke-on-Trent being consigned to one. To set the context of this work, I think it's really important to give you a very brief overview of North Staffordshire's industrial history and how globalisation in recent decades has impacted upon regional ceramic manufacture. Our industrial capacity remains in constant motion, where technological innovation moves at breakneck speed, facilitating reduced lead time through more efficient means of production. Today, a ceramic tile made at the Johnson's factory takes less than 30 minutes from raw material to fired and packaged product, with not one human hand touching the tiles. Back in 1974, 5,000 members of staff at Johnson's were employed to produce 2 million square metres of tiles a year. Today it has less than 300 staff, with the plant producing more than 3 million tiles per week. In the tableware sector, companies who have sustained profits and driven growth have continued to invest in advanced automation to increase output. The volume of ceramics being made in North Staffordshire is now higher than ever before. Whilst these advancements have massively reduced labour-intensive manufacturing, my research explores a re-evaluation of craft knowledge that once fashioned material objects in particular ways. It poses the questions: should traditional practices displaced from contemporary production be simply relegated to history or the trails of the heritage sector, or do they offer fertile territory to unravel new modes of thinking and creativity in a digital age? As many of you will be fully aware, the 6 towns that constitute Stoke-on-Trent have been famed for their industrial scale pottery manufacturing since the 18th century. Alongside pioneers of the Industrial Revolution, such as Josiah Wedgwood and Spode, the Staffordshire potteries in the late 19th century comprised of hundreds of relatively small factories with more than 2,000 kilns firing millions of products a year. By 1938, half the workforce of Stoke-on-Trent worked in pottery factories, with employment peaking in 1948 to an estimated 79,000 people. To this day, Stoke-on-Trent continues to be affectionately known as the Potteries, one of the few British cities with a distinctive regional identity that remains synonymous with a particular industry. Yet during the last 3 decades, escalating global competition has resulted in many North Staffordshire-based companies struggling to adapt or compete in both domestic and export markets. Rapid changes in lifestyle preferences, together with increased global competition from East Asia in the 1990s, forced many key factories to outsource high volume and low to mid-cost production to developing economies, where energy and direct labour costs were a fraction compared to those in North Staffordshire. This strategy, coupled with the advances of production technology, has proved highly detrimental to a phenomenal concentration of human skills and knowledge in Stoke-on-Trent, to what was in 1991 a 22,000 strong workforce. From the late 1990s, these commonplace headlines, together with the physical evidence of the effects of the industry's economic downturn, prompted the beginnings of what has become an ongoing process to archive industrial transitions occurring across the 6 towns. This wasn't motivated by nostalgia for past glory or a fetish for ruin porn, where the aestheticisation of social collapse eclipses the context of the related trauma. These images were driven by a compulsion to highlight the ensuing effects of globalisation from an insider's perspective, whose personal and social ties have been intertwined with the area's histories of ceramic manufacture. Both my maternal and paternal ancestry were employed in the North Staffordshire potteries. From an early age, my familiarity with pottery terminology was brought about from my grandmother's lifelong employment in the industry, where she experienced numerous skilled and semi-skilled jobs. On the right here is an image from 1859, a group of employees who had served a total of 54.5 years service, with a family descendant, Moses Brownsword, on the left. Seated in the centre of the group is Francis Wedgwood, Josiah Wedgwood's grandson. As the industry remained a dominant employer in the late 1980s, it was perhaps inevitable that I would follow a similar path. And at the age of 16, I was apprenticed at the Wedgwood factory, where I trained initially as a tableware modeller. This formative period was instrumental to my understanding of the wealth of human dexterity transmitted from generation to generation within each division of labour, something which I continue to cite throughout my creative practice. However, my return to the Wedgwood factory some 15 years later sought a very different agenda. An increased awareness of the displacement of craft practices in the ceramic industry prompted the documentation of many of these traditions as a key element of my doctoral research. Filmed during an intense period of economic restructuring in 2003, nearly 80 hours of raw footage was captured over 8 months, providing a unique insight into the industrial tacit knowledge increasingly displaced by technology and automation. Alongside this documentation, I began to salvage the clay detritus residual from each process, as this ephemera made tangible many of the hidden human actions that accrued within each skill specialism. As systems of product uniformity and standardisation became the norm within industrialisation, any trace of human touch that remained in manufacture was considered an imperfection. Yet these byproducts of manufacture bore within their fabric the physical imprints of the hand, providing a direct connection to the repetitive skills passed down from generation to generation. Clay turn-ins, rejected wares and other inadvertent discard were later fired to preserve the momentary imprints of the hand. Materials rescued via this process constituted the work's salvage series, a spatial assemblage flanked with juxtaposing film loops that documented demonstrations of high craft skill against the dereliction and demolition of once prevalent sites of manufacture. Salvage series was not a glorification of an industry's distant past, where lead poisoning, silicosis, and the debilitating effects of poverty were endemic. It sets out to elucidate the diverse knowledge and nuances of dexterity embedded in aspects of ceramic production, to draw attention to its increasing disappearance. Exploring the physical site of production as a raw material itself was instrumental to topographies of the obsolete. A research project I initiated in partnership with the 2013 British Ceramics Biennial and Bergen Academy of Art and Design. It involved a site-specific artistic response to the former Spode factory, which fell into administration in 2008 and was being repurposed via numerous culture-led regeneration initiatives, rebranding the city as World Capital of Ceramics. Yet within the regeneration agenda of place, there is often an undue haste for local government and cultural organisations to circumvent the fallout of industrial change in favour for more sanitised narratives of recent history. Tackling the complexities of Stoke-on-Trent's post-industrial ceramic situation has often led to charges of wallowing in decline or being complicit in a retrospective idealisation of the industrial past. Yet the core rationale for topographies was to challenge this politicised amnesia and seek out greater critical discourse to the realities of those transitions and their impact upon people, place and traditional knowledge. Throughout the period of co-leading the project, a total of 97 artists and cultural commentators from 13 countries explored a variety of perspectives and practices to examine the industrial ruin, the globalised landscape of ceramics, and the artist as archaeologist. Though working with such a loaded site, participants were inevitably confronted with the ethical dimensions of dealing with its post-production spaces, infrastructure and residual materials. Frequent questions surrounded the role of the artist working in a non-art space, such as, do artists destroy the archaeology of a site, or do they contribute another layer of production? Or is the artist instrumental to the renewal of such places, or merely an apocalypse tourist cashing in on social misfortune with little long-term effect? Although many paradoxes remain, a primary impact of the project was that the funding we raised from the Norwegian Artistic Research Programme sourced local labour to restore and make safe previously inaccessible areas for ongoing cultural use. Funding also enabled me to hire out and collaborate with a small group of ex-pottery hand painters in a performative installation, National Treasure. Companies that had survived the impact of global competition have in recent years capitalised upon factory tourism. In these situations, the reality of social redundancy, mass automation and outsourced production is often obscured by marketing strategies that heighten the cachet of the handcrafted. Today, many high-end ceramic skills that were once the flagship of renowned manufacturers are often regarded as outmoded or economically unviable to accommodate today's rapid shifts in consumer trends. In an attempt to elevate the status of these threatened practices, the primary objective of National Treasure has been to restage the performance of these at a variety of loaded locations. The work involved the hire of a small group of China painters who remain a senior generation in Stoke-on-Trent, whose profession has gradually been displaced by the changing tide of fashion and by ceramic print technologies for mass production. Pictured here is Anthony Challoner, who has worked as a China painter since the age of 15. Serving as a series of provocations, the painters were set to work in a post-industrial context amongst the wreckage and disorder of the former Spode factory. Separated behind glass as they plied their skills, the viewer is confronted with a situation that evokes both admiration and discomfort. The artisans were instructed to paint on the back of damaged and discarded plates found on site at the Spode factory, with imagery that imitated the 18th century's romanticisation of British ruins through ceramic painting. Though portraying picturesque decay was not the objective here. The spaces within the plates where a painter would traditionally sign their workmanship were instead graced with images documenting the post-industrial fallout of Stoke-on-Trent. Working within their own time structures, each artisan would occupy the space intermittently, dissolving the hierarchical relationship between employer and employee. Vacated but illuminated workspaces, together with the residues of labour, extended metaphors surrounding the presence of absence within the work. Ironically, with this outsourcing of people and their skill as a raw material, the ethical dimensions of this process remain paramount. Artisans were hired above their indicated rates of pay, and their roles were fully credited within the work. National Treasure was not a nostalgic repetition of the past, but a representation of the past positioned in the present, that served to negotiate wider discourse surrounding the cultural and social impact of redundancy following a period of regional industrial change. The opportunity to perform National Treasure in South Korea, a country that gives status to individuals with exceptional artistic ability to preserve and nurture cultural heritage, provided a prestigious platform to raise greater awareness of Stoke-on-Trent's endangered craft practices. In 2003, UNESCO implemented a convention to safeguard intangible cultural heritage. 178 countries have now endorsed this convention, effectively making intangible heritage part of their cultural policy. But the UK is still not one of them. As technology has substituted many of these embodied skills, there remains few apprenticeships to secure the effective transfer of this knowledge to future generations. The importance of documenting several of these endangered practices became the focus of Reapprenticed, a project that set out to artistically reactivate the specialist knowledge of a group of former industry employees. To gain insights into the transmission and acquisition of these practices, I apprenticed myself to 3 former ceramic industry artisans in 2015. China painter Anthony Challoner, flower maker Rita Floyd, and copper plate engraver Paul Holdway, who are amongst the last generation of master practitioners in their respective fields. The project aimed to illuminate the procedural knowledge of each craftsperson's skill base, such as the nuances of preparation, material and haptic knowledge, pace and repetitive movements, which were made tangible through both film and object. Each skill specialism was deconstructed to arrest sequences of touch and craft intelligence that all too frequently remain overlooked. Questioning aspects of work which the artisans often took for granted facilitated detailed insight into such know-how and yielded a wealth of oral history which would have otherwise been lost. However, finding value in the active memory and knowledge of those affected by change has often led to the charge of nostalgia in a pejorative sense, and a eulogising of a past that's out of sync with an ever-changing world. Yet I would argue these first-hand recollections remain essential human narratives that can enrich our scope and understanding of industrial history. Whilst it's correct to guard against false memory, it is equally important that in the process we don't obliterate the kind of subjective reflection that can reveal greater insights about the past. Critical nostalgia, as Ray Cashman argues, acts as a powerful force for social reconnection without fixating on loss or the impossibility of return to the past. It can serve in many contexts to retrieve the past for support in building the future. Having acquired a basic knowledge of each skill base through this ethnographic approach, I repositioned my role from apprentice to instructor, redirecting the nuances of actions, materials and process into new forms that were subsequently performed by each artisan. In 2015, the Victoria and Albert Museum facilitated an opportunity for me to develop a live version of Reapprenticed in their Raphael Cartoons Gallery, which holds Raphael's full-scale designs for tapestries that were made to cover the lower walls of the Sistine Chapel. Set against the backdrop of masterpieces of Renaissance art, this space provided a perfect context for public engagement with the performance of marginalised factory craft skills, re-choreographed under my instructions to emphasise the sophistications of material and haptic knowledge. By positioning fabricators of cultural commodities centre stage, these performances aim to challenge the museum's preservation of object embodiments of craft, rather than supporting conditions for the continuation and rejuvenation of such knowledge. This reassembly of collective skill formed the basis of a further project, Factory, which addressed the hierarchies and value systems culturally designated to aspects of North Staffordshire's industrial artisanship through 6 performances staged at Icheon World Ceramic Centre in South Korea. The ceramic practices of 2 ex-industry personnel, China flower maker Rita Floyd and mould maker James Adams, were re-choreographed alongside the culturally revered dexterity of 4 Korean master potters. By subverting and recontextualising procedural knowledge from both traditions, Factory sought to expose a shared language of spatial, material and haptic intelligences to bring into question established hierarchies assigned to modes of cultural production. China flower making is one of the few methods of mass production that relies completely upon the dexterity of the hand. With changing fashion, this industry in Stoke-on-Trent has all but disappeared, with Rita Floyd being one of a handful of still practicing artisans who retain this knowledge. Throughout the factory performance, Rita provided an intimate space for the audience to witness the rhythmic intricacies of touch evident within her craft. Yet points of passive spectatorship were immediately disrupted by a simple instruction for Rita to continuously discard and manufacture onto a 6-metre production line built within the gallery. In Korea, I also had the opportunity to work with Intangible asset Kwan Soo So, renowned for the continuation of many traditional forms of Korean ceramics. Through the collaboration, Kwan Soo produced a series of partially formed moon jars laden with the raw immediacy of touch. James Adams took these casually assembled components into a lesser revered mode of production, mould making, instrumental to the histories of ceramic manufacture in North Staffordshire, which paradoxically introduced the eradication of human touch through modes of standardisation. The subtle collision of these very distinct traditions attempted to renegotiate a sense of value to people and practices displaced through global economics on an international platform. Artefacts involved in the mechanics of ceramic production, salvaged from various factories in North Staffordshire, were also presented as a series of formal taxonomies within factory, as a means to reattribute a sense of value to such objects left behind following industrial change. What was interesting about these objects was that they were marked by a point in time, as prior to the factory's closure, they were deconstructed to prevent subsequent reproduction. Historically, when a factory would become insolvent, design assets such as copper plates and moulds would be absorbed by takeover companies and continued into a form of hybrid production. With reference to this historic process and to expand ideas surrounding the cultural transfer of aesthetics, practices and technologies, these objects were remoulded by Korean master mould maker Sin-Yun Cho and subsequently cast in porcelain, a material which traditionally is associated with high status. Master carver Yongchung Cho and painter Won Jong Lee applied traditional Korean iconography to these fragmentary reproductions of post-industrial discard, continuing the Western Romantic traditions of aesthetic decay and revealing tensions between cultural notions of value and perfection inherited through both traditions. With an awareness of South Korea's geopolitical and colonial histories and the marginalised status of former artisans from North Staffordshire, Factory attempted to counter hierarchical relations and the politics of othering via collaborative modes of investigation that stimulated reciprocal discourse through the cultural exchange of tacit and explicit knowledge. Reactivating obsolescence through non-commercialised production created a space where the holders of marginalised immaterial heritage could speak for themselves and renegotiate their own value in a cultural context where such embodiments of knowledge are revered, renewed and sustained for future generations. As an open-ended, unresolved work that privileges repetition and reconfiguration, Factories' various performative components have been expanded in a variety of contexts. The installation of factory in the project Place and Practices, which I curated for the 2017 British Ceramics Biennial, reclaimed the former Spode factory as a site of ceramic production. In this post-industrial context, factory enlisted Floyd and Adams, together with earlier collaborators, painter Anthony Challoner and engraver Paul Holdway, not to mourn a lost past, but to reveal the unrealised potential of these traditional practices. Through its remaking, factory offered an alternative model for the continuation, preservation and dissemination of endangered industrial skills in North Staffordshire. Prior to the exhibition, the Heritage Crafts Association published the Radcliffe Red List of Endangered Crafts, the first research of its kind conducted in the UK. It highlights important aspects of the UK's collective intangible heritage to reassess the current viability of traditional crafts and to identify those which are most at risk of disappearing. Endangered practices from flint knapping to Sussex drug making are listed, but the industrial crafts, particularly those in relation to North Staffordshire's ceramic production, continue to be unaccounted for. This is something I'm currently collaborating on with the Heritage Crafts Association to readdress this imbalance. Yet safeguarding this intangible cultural inheritance doesn't necessarily mean relegating these practices to the dogma of past traditions. One of the aims of a research residency at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2017 was to explore ways in which traditional knowledge can be transmitted to new modes of thinking, expression and representation. Historic repositories that record and structure and convey know-how from factory production, such as pattern and shape books, became a primary influence. Using examples held at the V&A and at Wedgwood Museum, I was drawn to the fragmentary traces of visual and textual instruction recorded with a casual fluidity. Stemming from these points of reference, I started to examine North Staffordshire's early industrialisation and the artistic and technological innovation that evolved through this period of cultural borrowing and assimilation. The need to work directly with objects from this timeline, beyond curatorial handling restrictions, led to late 18th and early 19th century ceramics akin to those held at the museum being purchased via online auction websites. Rendered with varying degrees of skill compared with their East Asian influences, nuances of painting and print unique to early Staffordshire ceramic production were digitally extracted from their form using rudimentary scanning procedures. Morphic and fragmentary images, established by the rotational and linear movements of objects during the scanning process, further distorted imagery typical of Britain's imperialistic impulse to profit from the exploitation of the exotic via its industrial revolution. The slippage that occurs through the process of the copy, either through limitations of tools, materials and ability, which are prominent characteristics in that period of Staffordshire's rise as a global centre of production, remained a continuous point of fascination. Through this lo-fi form of exploration, imperfections of the digital were embraced as a method to transform instead of replicate. Through further adaptation using lo-fi digital manipulation systems, images became a palimpsest of digital disruption that collectively constituted my own pattern book. To activate this pattern book, former Spode copperplate engraver Paul Holdway was invited to replicate one of the interlaced images that derived from a historic copy of an East Asian prototype, returning the immediacy of the digital back to the slow-paced tactile material interactions of handwork. In a live performance at the V&A, Holdway offered a rare opportunity to experience the nuances of an industrial craft seldom practiced, where the intimate space of tool, action and matter were amplified through a live feed microscopic camera. Skilled practices that have evolved through hundreds of years of ceramic industrialization represent so much more than just the mastery and control of materials and processes. They have shaped the complex social bonds, networks and pride forged through collective skill, which remains integral to the identity of places such as Stoke-on-Trent. Transmitting endangered knowledge through new contexts and ways of thinking, in collaboration with a senior generation of artisans, is just a small contribution to ensure that these industrial crafts continue to be practiced and disseminated. This safeguarding of our cultural inheritance has recently expanded to more tangible forms of overlooked heritage through the multifaceted project Externalising the Archive, showcased as part of the 2019 British Ceramics Biennial. Spode was one of the few ceramic manufacturers in Britain to have operated continuously for over 230 years on its original site of production. Within 11 of its buildings, there remains over 70,000 moulds that date from circa 1850 to 2008, when the company ceased trading. As the site is currently in the process of regeneration and its buildings repurposed, only a small percentage of this material has been recommended for retention. As byproducts of ceramic manufacture, moulds are rarely valued or preserved for posterity. The finished ceramic artefact has always taken priority over those objects associated with labour. Yet as tools that revolutionise mass production, they can illuminate the evolution of important technological and stylistic changes in design and industry that remain relatively under-researched. And having been previously trained as a model and mould maker, there potentially exist trials and prototypes within this untapped archive which may never have seen the light of day since their inception. Working in conjunction with Stoke-on-Trent City Council's Archaeology Service, a significant volume of contemporary moulds dating circa 2005 to 2008 were removed from the mould stores and installed in the external environment of Spode's former Jubilee kiln. Reconstructed to retain their architectural presence observed within their former environment, the moulds were left exposed to the elements as a deliberate provocation to encourage greater conversation surrounding their impending disposal. The majority of passing public's immediate response was that of wanting to protect the moulds from the effects of the elements, thus bestowing a sense of value to them. Their value was further iterated by 2 loop films in the space, which reconnected the complex dexterities involved within model and mould making and casting, utilised in traditional production. The function of this work was to raise questions regarding what we do with such material, as no one can reproduce from the moulds, as their intellectual property belongs to another factory. So do we just leave this material to go to landfill, Or are there other more innovative ways to both preserve and repurpose their sculptural aesthetics, for instance using their potential as an architectural module? Alert to the scale of the disposal issue, externalising the archive also piloted the use of photogrammetry and 3D laser scanning to create digital surrogates of a selection of mould typologies and their shapes as a means of preserving their physical information. The physical environments of 4 of the former factory sites' mould stores were also scanned and transformed by colleagues at Staffordshire University into an interactive tour enabling visitors to navigate their way into previously inaccessible spaces through touchscreen technology and virtual reality. Externalising the archive raised several interesting questions of whether the digital can substitute the physical presence of the site and its materials, which I'm sure most of you will agree it cannot. But it demonstrated scope for the innovative interpretation of heritage, which I plan to build upon in future projects to support the digitisation of a much larger selection of mould typologies, materials and technologies. Since my engagement in the project, Stoke-on-Trent City Archaeology Service has more than doubled the scale of its retention strategy, demonstrating how artistic intervention can influence policy and contribute to the protection of an endangered post-industrial heritage. To conclude, I just wanted to iterate that our intangible ceramic heritage is not something which is fixed in the past. Our hands help us to think, and physical making provides opportunities for serendipity that logic and control through digital can often inhibit. By colliding digital technologies with the intimate material and haptic knowledge of living heritage, traditions can be reimagined and constitute a new layer of production to North Staffordshire's rich and varied industrial history. Thank you very much for listening.